that was incredibly unusual and really was threatening to, again, this ideology that I called Protestant supremacy, which basically is arguing that it's religious difference that allows you to enslave other people. And so they were by worshiping together with enslaved and people of African descent, they were undermining that ideological justification for slavery.
Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. Today's episode of Dis-Affamie History Podcast will be exploring the complicated relationship between religion, race, and slavery in the early Atlantic world. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Christianity played a powerful role in shaping colonial societies across the Caribbean and the Americas. Missionaries, colonial authorities, and enslaved Africans were all navigating questions about faith, conversion, and freedom. But one of the most striking contradictions of this period was the emergence of what historians call Christian slavery, a system in which people who had been baptized and recognized as Christians were still enslaved. To help us unpack this history, we are joined by Katherine Gerbner, Associate Professor of History and author of the book Christian Slavery, Conversion, and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. Her research explores how Protestant missionaries and colonial societies in places like the Caribbean and the Atlantic world wrestled with the question of whether conversion to Christianity should bring freedom or whether slavery could coexist with Christian identity. Through this work, she reveals how ideas of race and religion evolved together and helped shape the racialized system of slavery that would define the modern Atlantic world. In our conversation today, we'll explore how Christian conversion became entangled with colonial power, how enslaved and free people navigated these religious structures, and what this history tells us about the relationship between faith, race, and freedom in the Caribbean and the wider Atlantic world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Katherine Gerbner to the podcast. So let's have a listen. Professor Gerbner, for coming on to the podcast, Dis-Affamie History. And, we're going to be discussing your book, Christian Slavery. And as I told you before we started recording, this book really provides the context for how the church was as a power structure and how people navigated and used it to their benefit or not, to be able to control the enslaved as well as to define who they were in society. So before we start, I'll just have you just do a brief introduction and maybe just a little preamble about the book itself.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. My name is Katherine Gerbner, and I am a historian at the University of Minnesota. And yes, as you mentioned, my first book is Christian Slavery, Conversion, and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. And it really emerged out of questions that I had when I began my research in graduate school about the relationship between Christianity and slavery. I had sort of one idea of how these two things related to each other. And as I looked in the historical records, I saw a different story that was not what I had expected. And this book really emerged out of the questions that I had as I did my research. So really, this book is about how Christianity was used in the early Atlantic worlds in the Caribbean and North America to create a structure that legalized enslavement. And it's also about sort of the shift from what I call Protestant supremacy, the idea that enslaved and people of African descent should be excluded from the church, to an ideology of white supremacy, sort of the creation of whiteness that emerged out of
Mhm.
Christian foundations, which is again a big surprise. But then I think the third thing that the book is really about is about the efforts of people of African descent to become church members, and they actually faced a tremendous amount of pushback, persecution in order to do so because Christianity was associated with freedom and enslaving other people. And it was the
Mhm.
justification for why some people could be enslaved and some people couldn't. And that was another story that I felt hadn't been told. Oftentimes, we're given sort of this story about, forced baptism or, Christianity used as slave control. And this was a very, very different story than that. And so, for all of those reasons, I wrote this book.
Yeah, no, no, this is great. And, we'll get to some of these themes that you just mentioned because, well, first of all, I'm really curious, what was the particular moment in the archive where you realized that Christianity and slavery weren't operating the way we often assume?
Yes, there were, I would say, two moments for me. When I first started researching, I actually wanted to research the history of anti-slavery thought. And so I started with the first anti-slavery protest, which was written by Quakers in Pennsylvania in 1688. And so my first kind of oh gosh moment in the archive was when I was really doing research on that protest and realized that it had actually been rejected by the Quakers in the Philadelphia yearly meeting because, well, frankly, many of them were enslavers themselves. So that was a surprise that Quakers, who are often associated and very important for the abolitionist movements in the 18th and 19th century, earlier on, many of them were actually enslavers themselves, and oftentimes, even if they weren't enslavers, they were sort of supporting the transatlantic slave trade. So that was one aha moment. I said, okay, that's not what I was expecting. I need to ask more questions, and so I followed the Quaker community to Barbados, which is actually there were more Quakers in Barbados than in Pennsylvania at that time in the 1680s, and almost all of them were enslavers. And this was a surprise. But then the second major surprise I found in the archives was in the 1670s, there had been sort of a, a, a conspiracy to rebel among enslaved people. And okay, that's not surprising. And, that people would want to rebel. What was surprising was that the legislature in Barbados, the governor, blamed the Quakers for this.
Mm, yeah.
And this tipped me off to something that I would eventually call Protestant supremacy. The idea the other enslavers on Barbados knew that Quakers, while not anti-slavery, were proponents of basically evangelizing to people of African descent, and this was seen as a very dangerous practice. That's a surprise. Why was it dangerous to introduce enslaved and free people of color to Christianity and especially Protestantism? This became the question that fueled the project because I realized that there was a really important story to tell there.
Yeah, absolutely, because that power dynamic is huge in many
Mhm.
ways. And when an enslaved person sought baptism, what did that actually look like on the ground? And who felt most threatened by that possibility based on just the previous answer?
Well, there were many ways in which this could enact. We don't have that many sort of specific archival references to people of African descent, sort of specifically what they did, but we have a few. One comes from Richard Lygon's narrative that was written in the 1650s, and he talks about an enslaved man who, wants to actually become a Christian and asks about it. What does it mean to be baptized? And is sort of the has this conversation with Lygon where he explains like he would be interested in this, but there's so much resistance to it. And so that's one way that this could go, sort of a recognition that baptism was of interest and a desire to learn more, but a general sort of pressure from most enslavers that this was sort of something that they didn't want people of African descent to do. And the times when people actually did succeed in gaining access to baptism, we can surmise certain things. They may, in some cases, with the missionary records I looked at, they were actually being persecuted. The Moravians, especially, there are records where people who were able to be baptized in the Moravian church are then being, actually violently beaten and attacked because of this. In other cases, there are you might have sort of an enslaver who has a particular enslaved person that they sort of say, okay, this person I will educate and they can be baptized. But that's also in the minority. So there are a few different avenues, but I think the overwhelming evidence demonstrates that baptism, especially in the 1600s and the 1700s, is seen as a threat to enslavers. And this gets to the second part of your question, who felt most threatened by the possibility? And it was people who were invested in the slave system. And this really comes down to how can you justify enslaving other human beings, right? This fundamental question. And the answer to that question, I think it's it's sort of a hard thing for us to kind of put ourselves in the mindset of people who actually wanted to answer that question with an
Mm-hmm.
affirmative. But we have to understand that they did and that the answers changed over time. So in the 1600s, when the English were really just starting to what they would call plant their colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere in North America, the way that they justified enslaving other people really had to do with religious difference, right? That they were Christians and specifically Protestants, and that the people they were enslaving were not. Now, this was actually false in many cases, but
Mm-hmm.
that was the
Mm-hmm.
overriding ideology. And so Protestants, Protestantism specifically, also, in English America, was associated with um, power, right? Like to be a Protestant, to be free, to be able to vote. I mean, it was not the only thing you needed to be able to vote, but these are all markers of free status. And
Yes.
so to allow an enslaved person to become a Protestant was implicitly undermining the entire justification for the system of slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a huge power move. And in regards to that, like what moment where lawmakers removed the word Christian, does it was it's symbolic, and what was at stake in this particular language shift in terms of removing the word Christian?
This is such an important point that, one of the things that I did in my research is I went back and read literally every single law that was written in the island of Barbados in the 1600s and early 1700s. And through a linguistic analysis, you can see that a very important word early on is Christian, especially in distinguishing, you know, free status or, also those of like Christian servants from people of African descent who were presumed to not be Christian. So that is the word that is used to distinguish the free from the unfree. And what I found is that in the 1690s, and it's specifically in 1697 in Barbados, it happens in different times in different colonies. The word Christian is literally replaced with the word white. Now, the word white, the idea of that there are white people, that whiteness is a race, that has a history, right? It didn't really exist in the mid 1600s, and over time, however, especially as the system of slavery in the colonies became more established, this became a really important word. And so what you see is in Barbados, the legislators, the government literally replaces Christian status with the idea of whiteness as the new marker for who can be free and who can have political power. And so there was a tremendous amount that was at stake in this language shift, and it's really important to sort of see these moments as these pivotal changes in the ideology of slavery and the justification for slavery and the way that slavery was legalized in the colonies.
Hmm. No, definitely. And we're going to get more back to that. But I just wanted to talk about this one particular person. When someone like Cuffy Clark is
Mhm.
manumitted and then baptized, he seems to, embody freedom and, of course, Christian belonging. Why would that combination unsettle the planter class?
Yes, this is a so Cuffy is a formerly enslaved person who was freed at we don't know exactly when, but also baptized. And this is happening in Barbados in the 1600s. And he is actually, I looked through all of the baptismal records that still exist from Barbados. And so Cuffy is the first person of African descent who is free and baptized. Right. So we were talking before about how important these indicators, freedom, also Protestant status, uh, were for claiming political power.
Mhm.
So again, this is an implicit challenge. Here, Cuffy is a free person, so a free person of color. So I think implicitly then, just by existing, he is asking, there is a question being asked. Okay, when somebody is free and Protestant because he's baptized in the church, the Church of England, Anglican Church, that's what is important for the power structure. Can this person then vote? Can this person hold office? If Cuffy is able to uh, purchase property, right? Because that's the other major indicator of status, of freeholder status, the ability to vote. I think white enslavers saw this, saw sort of Cuffy, and also in the 1690s, there was a small but I think noticeable population of free Black Christians in Bridgetown specifically. And they kind of, in reaction to this, is what I argue, that's when they insert the word white in addition, or sort of in addition to sort of this idea of being Christian into the law books. And it's very striking that they do
Mhm.
so specifically in a law about who can vote in elections.
Yeah.
And so, in 1712, they sort of make an adaptation to their voting law that sort of defines what whiteness is, that uh, uses the one drop rule, which is, most historians think that that didn't emerge until later, but you see it in the early 1700s in Barbados. So this is absolutely essential, and it really demonstrates how baptism cannot be divorced from concepts of political power, and in this sort of colonial period.
No, absolutely. And I know that you're just taking this from, as an example, from Barbados, but I know within, I'll just say, my own personal research for my family tree, this came up significantly in terms of with free people being available and to be able to buy land, hold office. It was just amazing to be able to see that level of power being provided to people that were considered to be that were free and had, as you said, the one drop rule as well.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's really striking. And so and I think when we look in the records, seeing that this this didn't just sort of happen. Like there were actually people who were debating, I just imagine the room. Oh, we want to change this law. We want to add this word white. Like I want to hear what they said. These were people who were strategizing to maintain
Mhm.
their own power and make sure to, limit the power of free people of color specifically
Yeah.
in that instance.
No, absolutely. And then we're just going to go in just to more of the, I guess, the colonial laws that address baptism and slavery. Would you be able to include some examples like legislation in Barbados that spoke to this?
Yeah, so there are in Barbados, there are laws that try to basically convince enslavers that you can baptize enslaved people without them becoming manumitted. And this is not only in Barbados, you see this throughout the English colonies. So, Jamaica, but also places like Virginia and elsewhere. And I think what is striking about this is the fact that there was this, that they felt that this was needed, right? The fact that they needed to say in law, baptism does not result in freedom
Mm,
multiple times tells you that people were afraid, enslavers were afraid that baptism would mean that they could not uh, continue to hold people in bondage. And that is a, that tells you everything.
Mhm.
That explains why there was such resistance to the baptism of people of African descent specifically.
Mhm. And I know this probably just this next question just probably doubles down on this in terms of the that explanation of such as the an act of Barbados clarified that baptism did not automatically grant freedom. Like this was a specific act.
Yes. So again, it's just this is sort of one of multiple acts that sort of says it's basically it's okay, enslavers, you can allow enslaved people to be baptized. They will not, you can maintain your hold of them as sort of your property, right? Like that's
Mhm.
what they were saying. And so that that's sort of a aspect of the law that is repeated throughout the late 1600s, and basically until the idea of white supremacy really becomes more fixed. And that is sort of the ideology, the concept of white supremacy, that whiteness is what is the marker between a free person and a non-free person,
Mhm.
that or that justifies enslaving certain people and not others. Until that is sort of solidified, you continue to have these acts that I think are not convincing enough to enslavers, right? Like because
Yeah.
that's what, again, the repeated nature of them tells you, oh, okay, this is still a problem. And people who as slaveholders are continuing to think that they do not want to allow enslaved people to be baptized because of their fear for what that means for their property rights. And until I would say it takes until well into the 1700s for that to be less of a problem. And even then, there are other aspects of Christian conversion, including sort of, questions of literacy, like do you teach, teaching people how to read and possibly to write, which missionaries uh, would often do, but less so when they got pressure from enslavers. These were all sort of not just related to conversion, but also to political power.
Mhm. And I guess, the question then becomes, I guess, why was it necessary for colonial governments to make this so explicit? Was this just for a comfort level for the planter class?
There was pressure from, what we call the metropole. So like this is the English Empire and and eventually the British Empire,
Mhm.
that you know they have an ideology that is undergirding what they think they're doing in creating an empire and also endorsing and allowing transatlantic slavery, right? So, and for people who are more in the metropole, and for the Church of England, but also other missionary organizations, Protestant missionary organizations that I discuss in my book,
Mhm.
they they want to make sure that uh, the expansion of the English Empire and slavery is equated with the expansion of Christendom, like expanding Christianity. So that's how they understand the purpose, or one of the sort of ideological justifications for both and colonization and for enslavement. And so they have a vested interest in making sure that, well, that those who want to be baptized in the Protestant Church, especially the Church of England, are allowed to, right? Like and that is coming from, the Bishop of London, and there's many different authorities in England that want this to be the case. And so there is pressure. I traced in some cases it's missionaries who are actually putting pressure on the legislators to make these laws so that their missionary work is less hindered by enslavers who are not allowing them to even talk to enslaved people. And
Yeah.
so that's the dynamic, is that you know, missionaries, people in England who are sort of think about the empire as something that is sort of implicitly supposed to spread Christianity, that they're trying to make that happen, and they're realizing that it's not happening because of the association of baptism with freedom.
Hmm. Definitely. And I guess this goes into my next question about, Christianity was often associated with spiritual equality. What did enslavers fear might happen if conversion was linked to legal freedom?
They were afraid that there would be a rebellion.
Mm,
I mean, they say that explicitly multiple times.
mm,
They say, yeah, how could we possibly keep, Christians enslaved? Like, what's going to happen? Of course, they'll rise up against us. And, this is the answer to the question of my sort of second archival moment, this moment where the Barbados legislature passes a law in after a conspiracy uh, that forbids Quakers from worshiping with enslaved people. Right?
mm,
That's so strange. And but then you see it again and again. And in fact, every single either a conspiracy or actual rebellion in the 1600s and 1700s somehow gets blamed a little bit on, you know, missionaries and Black Christians. You see this in the 1710s in New York with the rebellion there that the Anglican missionaries are blamed, and people and Black Christians who are going to meet with missionaries are blamed. And I think that this just tells you that there is an underlying suspicion about like what happens when you have an enslaved population that is then recognized as also a Christian population. What is that going to happen? So they were absolutely terrified of
mm,
rebellion, and just sort of worried that, in the words of the Barbados governor in the 1670s tells a Quaker missionary, they'll rebel and cut our throats, right? Like that's what they're thinking about. And yeah, so that's why one of the reasons that they were so resistant to
mhm.
baptism.
Yeah, and I guess at a certain point, Protestant slaveholders removed the word Christian from their legal definitions of freedom. Why was this word again shift so important? And then, of course, the second part of it is what impact did this change have on race and legal status?
Yeah, they once they sort of remove Christian and insert white instead, this and this is actually another shift that legislators are making, but that's supported by missionaries
Hmm.
and supported by anyone who's more concerned with evangelization than than sort of
Yeah.
the fact that there's a enslavement, right? These are not anti-slavery Christians. They're people who are really committed to making sure to do everything they can to just spread the gospel. And so this shift is important because now you have a new justification for slavery. Now it's based on this idea of race, which again is like everything has a historical, evolved historically. And this is the moment when, uh, you know, whiteness becomes a legal category. And it is becomes a legal category in order to provide a new justification for enslavement that's not based on religion. And that allows missionaries to make a better argument to enslavers that baptism will not undermine their property rights
Mhm.
and that they will continue to be able to hold Christians in bondage just as they had held what they perceived as sort of non-Christians in bondage.
Mhm. Just this, continual theme, but again, just reworking it to make it to their advantage. So, with the Quakers, they appear very prominent in this book. Why did their desire to admit to enslaved Africans into meetings as spiritual equals pose such a threat to the plantation order? And I know that you probably touched upon this on the previous answer before, but is there anything else that you can add to that?
Yes. So the Quakers, I think are for many people are the surprise in this book because really most people, if they know about the Quakers in the colonial period, they know about their anti-slavery and abolitionist efforts, and they were so important to the abolitionist movement in the 18th century. And and so they've always been seen as kind of this radical Protestant group that pushed for equality. And the problem is that in the 17th century, they were radical, but they were not radical in these ways. Uh, and so the radical idea that they had was basically that uh, people of African descent and people of European descent can and should worship together, right? That all could, have the light of God within them in the ways that's the sort of the way that Quakers put this, that they could be equally, they were equal in that sort of spiritual sense, and so in the sense that they could all, co- you know, be hear God, right, and be able to testify to that. So this is, but this actually, this wasn't immediately apparent. So what happened was that George Fox, who was the founder of Quakerism, he, you know, his movement started in the 1650s during the English Civil War, and it expanded very quickly. They were a very successful missionaries, and there were Quakers, spanning out to multiple places in the globe. Notably, women as well as men. Quakers were radical again in their approach to gender, that women could also sort of speak. And so they came to Barbados, and there were many people who were convinced. That's the way that Quakers talk about conversion, is convincement. They don't have a baptismal ritual, which is another distinguishing factor between them and the Anglicans and Moravians and other Protestant groups. Um, but in Barbados, they many sort of enslavers are convinced, and so become Quakers. And then in the 1670s, George Fox travels to Barbados, and what he sees is that the friends, as the Quakers call them each other, that many of them were not actually sort of bringing the word to the enslaved members of their household. And so he makes this speech, sort of he in Barbados in the 1670s, where he says, "I you should you need to do this. You need to sort of preach and sort of include all members of your household in these worship services." And that was sort of the radicalism of that time. It doesn't sound as radical to us now, but I think it's important to see again. You can see the reaction, but from the other white colonists at the time, that was incredibly unusual and really was threatening to, again, this ideology that I called Protestant supremacy, which basically is arguing that it's religious difference that allows you to enslave other people. And so they were by worshiping together with enslaved and people of African descent, they were undermining that ideological justification for slavery.
Yeah. And, again, when the Quakers then migrated from Barbados to Pennsylvania, sometimes bringing their enslaved people with them, how did this relocation, affect the religious and racial dynamics? And additionally, did Pennsylvania offer a different context for Christian slavery?
Well, in the 16, Quakers were persecuted in Barbados, and increasingly so in the 1680s and 90s. And so what you see is sort of increasing migration of Quakers with enslaved people away from the Caribbean to places like Pennsylvania, which in 1683 had become an official Quaker colony under William Penn. And there they have a really important impact in that, I would argue they prolong the Quaker adoption of anti-slavery and abolition for 100 years. So, it actually took until the 1770s for the Quakers to actually forbid, or what they would call disown, uh, slave owners from coming to Quaker meetings. And this was largely an impact of the of sort of those friends who had migrated from Barbados, who were deeply invested in not only sort of having owning enslaved people themselves, but also many of them also were traders. They were merchants, so they were invested in the slave trade. And these were often wealthier people. the people who were, again, at the helm of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And so it took a tremendous amount of effort on the part of anti-slavery and eventually abolitionist Quakers to sort of rally enough support within the Society of Friends in order to actually succeed in making it a abolitionist uh, denomination.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, in your research, you examined baptismal records and religious archives. Were these records primarily held by the churches, or were their copies also maintained by colonial governments?
Yes, I went all over to look at records. So I the denominational records that I looked at were the Church of England's denominational records, and specifically the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was the missionary wing of the Anglican Church that was founded in 1701. So many of those records are in London at Lambeth Palace Library. Those are very important records, span the Caribbean, North America, elsewhere. The Quaker records were also important for my research. Those, you know, the ones pertaining to Barbados are mostly not in Barbados. They are in Pennsylvania and they're in London. And so you have this sort of, this is actually very typical of, the research I do, which is actually centered in the Caribbean, but many of the records are held in, the metropoles of the imperial of the empires or the denominational headquarters of particular denominations. So um, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia for Quakers at the Haverford Archives and the Swarthmore Archives, and but then also the most are in London.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one group we haven't really talked about that I also looked at for the book was the Moravian Church. And the Moravians are actually headquartered in Eastern Germany. It's sort of an unusual story, but they play a very important role, especially in evangelizing to people of non-European descent, whether people of African descent or indigenous people. They go all over the world. They define themselves as the global missionary church in the 1730s. And their records, which are really the best of all of them, are primarily in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is one of the towns that the Moravians settled,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and Herrnhut, Germany, which is in the headquarters. It's very far east in Germany, and in London. But then just to get to your governmental records,
Mm-hmm.
there are some in the Caribbean themselves itself. I actually looked at a lot of the baptismal and marriage records have been reprinted, and so you can get those in book form. Those are fantastic. So, and then the laws, which you can, there are sort of printed versions of them from the 1600s and 1700s that are available. There are multiple copies available. They're rare books, but they have multiple. There are multiple extant copies. So I was looking at all of these records and then sort of in different, depending on what question I was trying to answer, I was comparing them in different ways.
Yeah, no, fantastic. 'Cause- And again, it's never where you think that they are, and that's why, people, think that, oh yes, I just need to go to this one particular island. It could be anywhere in terms of the records. And,
Oh my
for the
gosh.
type of
Yeah.
records that you're looking at, what do they reveal that other documents do not?
Well, each genre of record gives you different kinds of information. So, a will is interesting because you might, or like a, probate document, you'll have a list of material objects in a house, or, in the case of enslavement, because enslaved people were considered property, you have information about what happened to individuals. And that's where you often get a name, right? And so those are important in that respect. And you can do a lot of of work with that kind of documents. A baptismal record will give you different information. When I was looking at all of the baptismal records for Barbados, they do distinguish when someone is not white. And that's helpful for me because then I can count the number of people of African descent who are being baptized and sort of and use that to compare to other records like, okay, the legal records. The legal records tell you not what was actually happening, but what people hoped would happen, what
Mhm.
certain people, the legislators, people in power, were hoping would happen, and what they were trying to stop. So that's what that record can tell you. Missionary records can tell you other kinds of details. So each denomination has its own way of creating records. So the Quakers and the Anglicans, you know, they're frankly like sometimes frustrating in what they decide to record and not record. The Quakers complain a lot about their own persecution at the hands of Anglicans, but they say very little about the lives of enslaved people who live with them. And so that's a frustrating thing as a historian trying to tell a different story. Um, Similarly, the Anglican records, there are few missionaries who are better at observing and writing about, um, you know, big questions like why would an enslaved or free person of color want to be baptized? What were their lives like? You get a little bit of that, but not very much. The Moravian records are what I would say the absolute best when it comes to being able to tell more full stories of why people made choices, on the ground and what people's lives were actually like. They have the most about individuals, and so I use each of these types of records for different purposes, and I kind of tried to do as much as I could with each type of source that I was encountering.
No, absolutely. It's just the under, you just don't imagine how much information is there and how to decipher and what document holds what information, and just trying to piece that all
Mhm.
together. So, Professor Gerbner, like, how does your work, reshape how we think about the historical role of the church in systems of racial hierarchy?
Yes, so I think when I went into this, and I think many of us have an idea of the church that has been influenced by ideas of sort of secular government, like the church is, the church is the church, and then, it's separated from other things. What That's just not true for much of the colonial period. The and also if you look at sort of the structure of the colonial government, the everything is good, divided by parish, and then there's a vestry, and these are people who have like political appointments, and so like church and state are deeply intertwined.
Mhm.
Um, and this is really, significant for understanding the history. And also, I think placing the history of the church and church records back, I would argue they should be more to the center of our focus. These are not marginal things, these are absolutely central. And they're really important records that we should be paying attention to because they were not just about, people's religious
Yes.
experiences, right? Like this is about uh, it's about political power as well as about the formation of particular communities and inclusion and exclusion. There's so much to be learned from church records, and in order to do so, I think we need to have a different view of what the church is and what its role is in society.
No, absolutely. And of course, with what you're saying with the other Protestant religions, these are normally under what's called, especially in the British system, the dissenter records, most of the times,
Yes.
where people would find them. But then, of course, when you're researching, you're just thinking it's just in one area, not realizing there's another group of
Yeah.
records that you could find. And, Professor Gerbner, as we are coming to a close with this episode, what message would you like to leave listeners, especially those tracing Caribbean or Atlantic ancestry, to take away from Christian slavery?
Well, I hope that, practically speaking, there are, as you said, so many other opportunities to do research. And in fact, I think one of sort of the tricks is that, we think of even like Church of England or the Anglican churches as sort of the way to go. Then actually, there are so many other Protestant denominational records that are richer than the Church of England's records. So really expanding one's horizons when it comes to sort of thinking about where can I look to understand the past. And here, the Moravian records are really incredible. For the period I look at, they're mostly in a very difficult to read German script. So
Mhm.
that's not so easy, but they eventually, especially in the Anglophone Caribbean, they switched to English script, and those records, they're not in the Caribbean there, but they are accessible. They're digitized at the Bethlehem Moravian Archives, for example. There are and there are more records in Herrnhut that are not digitized, but there's such a wealth of opportunity depending on, what one's questions are, sort of, for people doing sort of family research, like understand, like, which congregations people were a part of. But, one part of my research is looking at what's now the U.S. Virgin Islands, and there are Danish records, right? Like
Mm.
the Caribbean is such a interesting place, and there's so many overlapping uh, institutions, churches that made records that pertain to Caribbean history. And so, broadening out from the expected and allowing yourself to sort of be surprised, and then, try to find those unexpected avenues to do research. I think there's a lot to be found that is really exciting.
No, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you coming on to the podcast and discussing this, because this is can be a touchy subject in terms of when it comes to when you mention the church and not
Yep.
realizing, as you said, they hold a lot of information, and it's not just, birth, death, and who got married and so on and so forth. So thank you again for your time, for coming on to the podcast to speak about this, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.